I am the trade ally and training manager here with Efficiency Vermont. I've been doing a lot of code training work over the past many years here on behalf of our work as energy code support for the state. So today we're going to cover some more recent updates to the implementation of the residential energy code and talk more specifically about the options that are allowed for modeling, building envelope, and component conformance for the code versus prescriptive compliance. And because of some of the recent changes that came up last week, we're going to discuss both the options for 2020 and for 2024. So if you have questions as they come up, please, as noted, put them in the chat and I'll check in with Alex and keep on top of those as we go. So just to share out of the gate, content that we're sharing as a part of this today is published, copyrighted by the International Code Council. And there is the 2024 Vermont Residential Building Energy Standard now published and available on the ICC site. So I'll show you where to find access to that, but we are sharing content that is published by that entity. The main thrust of what we're talking about here today is that the Vermont Residential Building Energy Standard offers 3 different options for showing compliance with the code. The most typical approach and what has been the most modeled or approachable pathway for people to comply with the code has always been the prescriptive pathway. But there are 2 pathways in the code that allow for modeling energy performance of the total building. And we'll talk about the distinction between those 2 models and why one may be a little bit different than the other. But essentially, we're looking at modeling the overall performance of the building rather than just prescriptive compliance based on individual components. So just to level set where this content lives and where it can be found, the code, all of the related code documents for the RBES and for the CBs are housed by the Department of Public Service. So if you go to the Department of Public Service website and you scroll down to the efficiency tab on the left-hand side of their landing page, you'll get into the options for both residential and commercial energy codes. So here is a screenshot of what you would see if you clicked into that today. And what has changed as of last Wednesday was that the governor, as a part of his weekly press conference, issued an executive order that is allowing for compliance with the residential building energy standards at this stage and moving forth through 2027 to be either complying with the 2024 or the 2020 version of the residential building energy standard. So that's a significant change from what had been in place to that point, which was that the 2024 residential building energy standard went into effect as of July 1st of last year. And that was the current standard of practice that needed to be met for any applicable building types that landed under RBES. But now, as of last Wednesday, the option exists to comply with either standard. So when you land on the department website, you're going to find the 2024 code reference documents. And this is where you're going to be able to access what's currently required. And then if you scroll down further onto that page, what the 2020 code requires as well. I'll jump to their website here now to just kind of scroll through what that looks like. So at the top of the landing page is what I just shared in that slide. These are the 2024 code requirements and reference documents and standards. If you scroll down to the next section below that, this will give you the reference standards for the 2020 code. So, depending on where you're at in design stage and what standard you're seeking to comply with, this information also exists here, just to navigate and show you how these links work. So the code itself is published again by the ICC, as I noted in that initial slide. So if you click into the link on the department site that sends you there, this sends you to the ICC website. And then this is where you have access to the free viewable copy of the 2024 code. So you can find this is the current quote unquote 2024 version of the code. If you want to find the previous version of the code, you can click into the individual states, and then you'll find what other standards are published here by the IECC. And then you can go into which version you want to go to look at and reference. So from here, you can also access both the 2020 versions as well as the 2024 versions. So just giving you that context for where to find different documents. We're going to go more into that in detail here shortly. I'll go back to the website and the web browser access to the REScheck tool and how to access that as well. So that is just level setting for what's allowable now for compliance with the residential code, either the 2020 or the 2024 version. Again, there's 3 different compliance pathways to show compliance with the code. And there's technical compliance, that you've actually built the building to meet the full standard of the code. And then there's the certificate of compliance, or the code certificate, that needs to be filled out to show how you got there. So I'm sharing here the 2024 version of the RBES code certificate. I'll go into this in detail here now. Later on in the content here today, I also reference a 2020 version of the code certificate. But either way, this is where you're providing documentation of how you complied with the code. So the 2024 version of the code is 2-sided. There's 2 pages to it. Previous versions had just been 1 single page document. But what you're completing here is information about the project, the actual physical address, when the construction started, when it completed, what the units were, the height, the size of the building, applicable code. So either base or stretch code. Talk briefly about where that would apply, but typically you're meeting that base code. There are some circumstances where a property would need to meet stretch. If it's a renovation or an alteration or something other than new construction, then you'd be identifying that here. And then the other document that comes into play covers the details of as-builts for the building. What we're going to be diving into in more detail today is these 2 compliance options here. So on this first page, this gives you those 3 pathways of compliance you can use to show compliance with the code. Option 1 is prescriptive compliance. We'll touch on that briefly. But then these other 2 options, REScheck and HERS rating, ERI, are where you're doing actual comparative building energy modeling to show that you've complied with the code. So the difference here is that REScheck is a open source platform tool, website enabled modeling tool that the builder is intended, or whomever it is that's certifying for the code, uses to enter the building data and generate the report to show as compliant, versus working with a third party, which is the HERS rater. And the HERS rater is the one who's doing the modeling and going into a little bit more detail than what the REScheck option would allow for. So when depending on, no matter which pathway you show or choose to comply with the code, this second page of the code certificate will need to be completed. All of this very fine print at the top of the code certificate is specific to prescriptive compliance. So the only time you'd be using any of these checkboxes at that first stage of this second page of the code certificate would be if you've chosen prescriptive compliance over REScheck or HERS rating. No matter, this next section of thermal envelope needs to be completed as built. So this is where you're defining what performance specifications the building shell and different components of the building were built to. So you're putting in the actual as-built values for each component of the building that is relevant to the build in this thermal envelope section. Air sealing and blower door test. This has been a requirement since the 2020 code. So no matter if you're going to comply with 2020 or 2024 at this point, you are required to have a blower door test done by a third party to verify that the building is not exceeding the ACH threshold required by the code. Difference between the two is that the 2020 code allowed for the building to not exceed 3 air changes per hour, whereas the 2024 code has dropped that to 2 air changes per hour. And then the 2024 code is also looking to have the blower door result defined as both air changes per hour and CFM per square foot of surface area. And that's the 6 sides of the building shell. The lower half of that second page of the code certificate gets into the mechanical side of the building. Ventilation system, combustion safety. Combustion safety comes into play if you have any type of open combustion, solid fuel burning appliances in the home, a wood stove, fireplace. Mechanical system is basically the as-built and basis of design for the heating and/or cooling system for the home. So if this is a new home, this section is going to be completed with all those details for either one or the other, or both, one or both, for heating and or cooling. Ductwork, if you have a forced air system where you're moving your heat throughout the building via air and ductwork, 2024 code requires that all of that ductwork be within the building thermal envelope. It does not require any level of duct testing for air leakage through the ductwork. The 2020 code does allow for ductwork outside of the building envelope, but in those circumstances, there are requirements and standards in place for duct leakage testing to the exterior. Bottom line is, frankly, at this point, really, you should be just, if you're doing a ducted system, the ductwork really should be within the building envelope. Ventilation system, that's another difference between 2020 and 2024. 2020 code allows for exhaust-only ventilation, meaning you can use bath fans on timers that are set to run at a required ventilation rate that the ASHRAE 622 standard would define for the building. The 2024 code moved the requirement to be balanced heat recovery ventilation. So that's a significant difference between these two codes at this point, depending on which code you're going to choose to comply with. But the 2024 code does require balanced heat recovery, whereas the 2020 code would have allowed for exhaust only. Any questions at this point? Okay.
Not seeing any, Steve.
Thank you. All right, so just to reference back again, where I'm referencing here as sections of the code, go to the ICC document, the actual published ICC code, not to the RBES handbook. So this is the section we're referencing for the compliance options, chapter 4. Again, 3 different pathways to show compliance: prescriptive, package plus points requirements, REScheck, and HERS rating. I apologize about the dog having this moment behind me here as people show up to the house. So hopefully that's not coming through too loud. Just a level set for the prescriptive pathway. So for the 2024 code, there was a significant change in the package options for prescriptive compliance. They shifted from there being 5 prescriptive package options to show compliance with the code to 2. And they combined both the base code and the stretch code packages together into a single table. So to reference that, this is the prescriptive package options for the 2024 code. A big change that occurred with the 2024 code from the 2020 that relates to the topic we're talking about today about building component modeling is that the prescriptive requirements shifted to a U factor requirement for the building assembly versus what had previously been just a referenced R value for the component of the assembly. Why this matters is that the U factor takes into account the total assembly performance, where you're factoring in how much of that wall, roof, floor assembly is framed cavity filled with insulation versus what percentage of that wall is framing material. And then it also takes into account the sheathing, the drywall, the air, separation between components, any continuous insulation that may be a part of the assembly. So this is definitely a different approach taken for prescriptive compliance than have been in the code in the past. And it directly relates then to modeling the whole assembly types for the building, which is what the REScheck pathway provides. So for the 2024 code, you're going to see this U factor as the minimum standard for compliance for any framed building component. There were some changes as well for R values for other building components that were not framed cavities. Those still show up as R values because there's a different dynamic at play there when we're talking about contiguous concrete sort of assemblies versus framed assemblies. But no matter if you're going to comply with the 2024 RBES prescriptively, you will need to do some level of modeling of the building components, framed building components for the building anyway, which is the same methodology taken if you're going to show REScheck compliance. So we'll show some details about how to get to those overall assembly values and what the meaning is behind that. The 2024 code also combined the base code and stretch code points requirements under one table. Some of those points values increased for stretch code, but the prescriptive approach requires that you meet all the technical requirements that are in the table that I just shared, and then based on the square footage of the conditioned area of the building, points need to be earned that are options to give you enhanced performance above base standard compliance. That's what that big section of fine print at the top of the code certificate referencing prescriptive compliance encapsulates. That's all the different points options that are available to earn points based on the square footage of the building. This points option or points included requirement came into effect in the 2020 code. So this has been around since that version. So it applies to both. There are more points options available in the 2024 code than there were in the 2020 code. Referencing back to the 2020 prescriptive table, this is what is in the 2020 code as your prescriptive package options. So you can see here that there are now 5 packages you can choose from for 2020 compliance versus just the 1 or /2, depending on how you want to look at it for the 2024 code. So again, this is an option available now based on the executive order from the governor as of last week. So just level setting for prescriptive compliance. But as I noted, the shift to the 2024 code looked at the overall performance of the building assembly for any framed building component. And what a U factor defines is a maximum target for that building assembly. So you cannot exceed the prescribed U factor for each of these building components for both prescriptive compliance to the 2024 code and then also the UA alternative, which is essentially what REScheck models for the building. So we're not just using the R value of the cavity and the those spaces of the building envelope. It's taking into account the performance of the entire assembly as a whole. And so this is just a brief example of what that looks like and what this takes into account. So, you can do this sort of comparative analysis and modeling longhand, right? You can define and determine the U factor of each component of a building assembly and combine that into a calculation and taking into account the percentage of framing in that cavity, et cetera. These modeling tools that we're going to discuss, this is the methodology that's used there to define the performance of the assembly. But this is just a quick, peek at what the difference is between, as it's defined here, an R20 cavity only insulation, R25 cavity insulation, and then this third option of R20 plus 5 continuous insulation. When you see that referenced in the code of R20 plus 5 or R20 plus 10 or R13 plus 10, those mean that the cavity is R20 and then the continuous layer of insulation is that R5, R10, R20, whatever that may, R10, whatever that may be. So as you do the modeling and calculate the performance of the overall assembly, it gives you the U factor of the full assembly. And then that is also can be translated into what the effective R value, total R value of that total assembly would be. So
Steve, while you're pausing, we have a comment that the 2024 RBES has increased the points that are required.
correct, yeah, as I noted a moment ago. So those points requirements are different than the 2020 version, and that's reflected in the table that exists in the code. So you can see the comparative difference between what 2024 would have required versus 2020. So what I'm sharing here is we're going to get into REScheck as a compliance pathway and option and get into the tool for what it does to show assembly values. Also, there is another pathway that can be used to do some quick analysis of proposed building envelope assemblies, and that is through Ecotrope. So again, this is another web-based tool calculator that can be used to model out layer by layer different building assemblies. This calculator, if you go to this website, will give you options for wall, roof, and floor systems. And then in the tool itself, you have options of adding or eliminating layers into the assembly. There's a default that you'll see in each of those categories when you go to that site to use the tool of, essentially break this down. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the interior gray layer, that's drywall. The next layer is the framed cavity, which is defined over here by stud cavity. You can define exactly what the assembly might be, but it defaults at a 2x6, 16 on center. The next layer is by default the sheathing layer. Next layer default by that is house wrap. And then what you're seeing in these other three layers here are continuous insulation as an assembly option. So you can model out different assembly types in this tool. That will give you in the output here at the top what the U factor of that assembly is, and then the effective R value. So again, if you're going to comply with the code prescriptively for 2024, you need to know that you're not going to exceed a U factor of 0.044 for an above grade wall assembly. And this is an option to use as a tool to give you some pathway on whether what you've proposed to build or what's being discussed would come in under that threshold or not. There's an export option here with the tool, and what that will do would be to generate a Excel spreadsheet that breaks down each of the layers that you've built, gives you the thickness of the material, the R value, and how that all comes together to get you the U value that's defined here in the tool. So this is another option to use that's available beyond using REScheck, if that's the compliance pathway you're going to go. Another example is using this for a flat ceiling requirement in the code, where this is kind of defining your typical truss sort of assembly, where you have a drywall interior facing, finish to the ceiling, a framed bottom cord to the truss, and then a continuous layer of blown insulation on top of that. That's modeled out here into this assembly to take into account the depth of that bottom cord plus the depth of the continuous insulation that sits on top of it. Gets you to the U factor for compliance. Just some examples of what those models might look like in an as-built assembly for code compliance, because we're getting to 0.020 as the threshold for the 2024 code prescriptively for flat ceilings. These same U factors that are defined prescriptively in the code are essentially what our REScheck is using as the values that your assemblies you model in REScheck will be based against. So we'll get into that, but this is the assembly typology that we're talking about here that gets us to meet those maximum U factor requirements that are called out in the code. Enclosed slope assemblies can be a little bit more challenging for what the code is calling for in the 2024 version of a 0.025 U factor for the full assembly. If you're doing dimensional framing for a cathedral ceiling, it does limit you to some extent what type of insulation you can use in that framed cavity if you're not doing any type of continuous insulation to get you below that threshold for the U value or U factor required. Again, this is what REScheck would be using to define its pass or fail for that assembly type when you're using the modeling tool. Again, these are pathways to look at how the assembly comes together and how it's evaluated. I think the visualization that comes from the Ecotrope tool is pretty handy as far as giving you the way to evaluate how each different component affects the total performance of the overall assembly. The code does offer pathways to do unvented enclosed slope roof assemblies that are either continuous insulation or not, cavity only, continuous, combination of the two. So those are referenced in the code. Stretch code, just to note, stretch code comes into play if a project is under the requirements and jurisdiction of an Act 250 permit. So if you're in a development situation, that Act 250 is a part of that permitting for that development. That increases the compliance requirement for any of the properties, any of the buildings that would be built underneath that permit and underneath that development. So it does increase the performance specification from base code to the stretch side of things. Also, individual towns can choose to adopt stretch code as their local code requirement as more stringent. South Burlington is the only municipality that has done that. So in South Burlington, it doesn't matter if it's an Act 250 permanent project or not, you would still need to meet the higher standard for stretch code. And the reason I bring this up specifically right now is that the way in both the 2020 and the 2024 version of the code, if you need to meet stretch code, it restricts your compliance pathway options to using the prescriptive package approach or working with the HERS rater. You can't use REScheck, which we'll get into here now in more detail, if you need to comply with stretch code. You either have to do prescriptively and earn points or work with a HERS rater to model the full building and the operational performance as well. So I'll pause here for any questions.
Yeah, Alan, but jumping back to wall values or wall U values, Steve Allen asked if fenestration is included in calculating the U value of the wall.
No. I mean, when you're modeling in REScheck, you're going to be modeling so if you have a wall assembly, you're going to be modeling out the net value of the full wall assembly, as far as what the framing and the whole, assembly looks like. And then you're also going to be entering in a separate line item for windows, fenestrations, doors. And you're going to be assigning the square footage of that total area of fenestration and the performance spec of the fenestration to that modeled wall assembly that you defined previously, that is, the overall component assembly. So that's how REScheck works. The Ecotrope tool is just modeling the asset of the assembly design, not taking into account windows, doors, or any penetrations through that. Any other, Rick here now at the chat, so not seeing any other questions right at the moment. So getting in specifics of REScheck. So REScheck is, again, one of the 3 pathways to show code compliance. It's available for base code compliance, that pathway. It's meant as an alternative to prescriptive compliance. It is meant to be a open source tool accessible by a builder or contractor to use to model out the performance of the building assemblies as a totality, and then a comparative UA performance value for the entire building. So that is what REScheck is calculating and then generating as a performance compliance report, is what the total U factor of the area of the entire building, the sum of the entire component area of the building, compares against what the code maximum target would require. So if it's basically modeling what you're putting into the tool against what a code compliant building of the same square footage and area would need to meet. The equivalent U factors that are used, these are referencing the 2024 code. This table also exists in the 2020 code, specific to what 2020 required versus 2024. But these U factors here that you see that are referenced in the code align with what's now in that prescriptive table for 2024 as well. So you're modeling to the same value, essentially. So when you go to the Department of Public Service website, the link to the REScheck software is found through their website and their link. I thought I had updated this slide, but apparently it didn't work. But what I'm going to do anyway is I'm just going to go to the website at this point. So this is landing you today on what the landing pages for the RB standards and requirements. So again, by default, you're going to get at the top part of the page what the 2024 requirements are. You can scroll down to 2020. The link to get to REScheck, the most easiest way to initially get there is to just go through this link on the department website. This brings you to the REScheck landing page with the Department of Energy. If you have not gotten here before, you can either click here for Launch REScheck Web, or you can click here at the top, same thing. There is a Getting Started guide, which I would recommend taking a look at prior to creating an account. But your initial click into the tool is going to basically bring you to a prompt to set up an account. And then you'll have access to the tool after you set up that account for use. So once you have established an account, it'll bring you into your landing page of projects that you are currently working on or developing.
Steve, are you showing a different screen? Because I think we still see the presentation at the moment.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. That sucks.
No worries.
I've gone into it in a little bit more detail here. Let me get back to that.
Thanks for pointing that out, Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Try this. All right. Are you seeing the Google?
Not at there. Okay. Yep. See a web page.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate you calling that out. So yes, this is where I was. So here we are, Department of Public Service landing page for the residential energy codes. Top of the page brings you to the current 2024 version, and then you can scroll down to what the 2020 links are. But to get to the REScheck tool, the easiest pathway to get there, if you've never been there before, is just click into the link that's in the on the website. This brings you to the Department of Energy site for the REScheck tool. If you have not established an account and created your own profile for the tool yet, you can either click into it here at this tab of REScheck Web, or over here, Launch REScheck Web. Either one brings you to the landing page to create an account and access to the tool. There's a Getting Started guide, which I would recommend looking at if you haven't used the tool before. But then, once you've created your own account profile, this brings you to the actual tool and the landing page. The landing page of the tool is going to have what projects you've created or are currently working on. So this is going to give you a list of any projects that you've started here in the tool. As a general tool, you can use REScheck to model out different scenarios to see how they perform, and both as an assembly itself and then also comparatively to what the codes would require. So you can create all sorts of different iterations here. You're not like by creating a project, you're not like committing yourself to something, right? You're using this essentially just as a tool to model out performance. But to create a new project, you're going to click into new project, and then this is going to give you right here, it says energy code, the drop down option of which code you're going to be modeling against. So this is important. You know, this is where you're defining the comparative UA analysis that you're going to do in the tool to which UA you're comparing it against. So this is the drop down of which options are available. And you'll see towards the bottom of that drop down list, you're going to have the Vermont 2020 and the Vermont 2024 code. So again, depending on which code you want to use at this point, based on last week's executive order, you'll be clicking into either one of these tabs. By default, it's going to be giving you a default for new construction, and then UA trade-off as the default for what you're seeking to comply with. So you're going to fill out the data points in here for project type, location. Location does matter as far as some of the comparative analysis that's being used. Conditioned floor area, you know, if you have questions as to what defines the conditioned floor area, there are these information tabs that show up. You know, orientation, you are defining which way the building is facing, like the main front of the building, and then that is used as the basis for defining each of the four sides at a minimum you're going to be modeling out into the building. So there's further detail to map out once you start a project. And then you're going to go from those project level details into envelope. And then from here, you know, you have the basics are you've got a ceiling, top of the building, walls, and then your basement foundation. And then in each of these categories is when you start to build out the individual components and the performance criteria of each defined wall or surface area. So in a, you know, ceiling section, there are certainly circumstances where you're going to have multiple entry types, where you'll have a flat ceiling that has specific characteristics in one area, and then there's a slope ceiling in another area, and then there may be a different slope ceiling or a different flat ceiling. So for any of those individual types of component, you will need to create and add a new measure and then define what the criteria of that assembly is. The tool does limit you to some extent on the typology. It gives you quote unquote typical building assemblies. So, you know, depending on which type you're selecting here in the defaults or the dropdown, it's going to give you then what component options you can complete. But total area of the component is kind of one of the key things. And then again, what the cavity value is of insulation, and then what the continuous insulation value would be. So again, for a flat ceiling, it's a truss, you're going to have a cavity value for the bottom chord, and then you're going to have a continuous value for what's blown in on top of that. And so these inputs may change based on different typology of the assemblies that you're defining here. So, you know, a structural insulated panel is not going to have a cavity value because it's a continuous assembly type. So for each building assembly component, you need to complete at least one entry. So at a minimum, a building is going to have at least 4 entries for walls. As a 4-sided building, it's going to have at least 1 entry for the ceiling, the top of the building, and then at least 1 entry for what the foundation or basement may be. Also here, when it comes to walls, again, you're going to define what the performance specification or the assembly type is for the full wall assembly itself. And then, you know, so you're going to, your typical drop down is going to be this 16-inch framing on center, cavity value, continuous value if there is. So you're going to create, again, at least 4 entries for that into the tool. And then on top of that, you're also then going to be creating window values for that as well too. You have to create a wall before you can create the window entry. But then you're going to assign what walls those windows land on. So it's accounted for in the total UA value modeling for the building. And then finally in the tool, once you've modeled out the complete building envelope, there's a compliance section. So this is essentially a checklist that references other mandatory requirements that are in the RBES that go beyond just the performance of the building shell. So this, you can see these references for sections. You can be referencing the code. I don't know which one I have pulled up here, but you can reference the, it's going to take a while to load, but these are the reference sections from the applicable version of the RBES that you've chosen to comply with. So when you see 302.1, 403.7, those are the reference sections from the 2024, the 2020 code. So if you want to understand what this is asking about and what you're verifying will or will not be met, those are the sections to reference to back into the code. And so each of these sections need to be completed. You need to have all of those components modeled out in order to generate a report and check compliance. I'm not going to check compliance here because we haven't modeled anything yet. So I'm going to go back to the slide deck actually at this point. And as I'm doing that, why don't we pause for questions?
Yeah, we got 3 questions in the chat here at the moment.
Okay.
First one from Michael. If all 4 walls are the same assembly, could you simply input one wall item with total gross area?
All right. Sorry, I got distracted. Say that again, please.
Michael asked if all 4 walls are the same assembly, could you simply input one wall item with the total gross area?
No, because you have to define its orientation. You have to assign it which way it's orienting. So you would need to, again, at a minimum, you got to have at least 4 wall assemblies modeled in the tool.
Okay. Next one from Alex. When entering the cavity value of a building assembly component, do we use the number generated by Ecotrope, which accounts for the framing factor, or the R value of the insulation only?
Right, hang on a second. And jump back to that question. All right, I'm sorry. Go ahead and read that to me again, Alex, now that I'm back to where I need to be.
Yeah, Alex asked, when entering the cavity value of a building assembly component, do we use the number generated by Ecotrope, which accounts for the framing factor, or the R value of the insulation only?
For the REScheck tool, the R value of the insulation only. The REScheck tool is essentially doing the same thing that the Ecotrope tool does. So you're modeling out the specs of each component of the assembly. So yeah, don't take data. That Ecotrope modeling tool I shared is essentially just another tool or asset to use to do comparative analysis of different building assembly options, more specifically to prescriptive compliance versus REScheck. If you're going to use REScheck as your compliance pathway, then what you're going to be basing your compliance on is the as-built you model directly in the REScheck tool. So yeah, just use your specific inputs for cavity and or continuous insulation into those tabs in REScheck to create your overall model for that comparative analysis.
Thank you. And then one more from Benjamin. Noted that you might get to this, but he did not see a sloped or wood rafter ceiling in that section you were showing.
There is a sloped option in the REScheck tool. So you'd be able to pull that up as an option.
Cool. There's all the questions we had at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Alex. So back to the slide deck here. So this is what the compliance certificate will show you. So once you've completed all of your modeling of the different building components and you have a full building assembly modeled in REScheck, it'll be able to generate this tool or this report. And then what the report generates is the area of the components that you've modeled for the building, And then the cavity R value and any continuous value that would be associated with that building that you've modeled, or those assemblies that you've modeled. And that would give you then what your modeled proposed U factor is for that assembly compared against this required U factor for the assembly. And then the UA is the U factor of the area of that assembly type as well too. So again, proposed what you've modeled versus required. So in this report, you're going to see where you are or are not complying with the component values needed to show compliance with the 2020 or the 2024 code. Again, this example here references the 2020 code. In this scenario, this is not passing, so 8.2% worse than code. So just as some examples here, the wall assembly that's modeled here on this oriented to the right side has a U factor for the assembly of 0.055059, whereas the required U factor is 0.044. So this is not a compliant component with the code. Same thing with the windows. In this example, 0.28 is what you proposed in the model here. 0.27 is required. So this is where, you need to start to look at, all right, where are we short? How do we need to tweak some assemblies to show compliance? But then essentially the idea being that you've modeled out the full building performance. It comes in under the maximum UA for the building. And then this report kind of is generated to support the compliance pathway that you've identified on the code certificate.
We did have another question come in.
Yep.
Jim asked, does REScheck allow calculations of double stud walls instead of layered single stud assemblies?
In the tool, you're going to have to figure out a way to define that between what the tool gives you the space to do, meaning that you really only have continuous versus cavity to work with. So you'll have to put the totality of the two into that component. So it doesn't give you, there's defaults that you have to work within when using REScheck. Compared to what the Ecotrope tool kind of models out for comparative performance, and or the REScheck or the HERS rating pathway. The HERS rating pathway and the modeling tools that are used to show compliance via HERS do allow for a lot more granular level of detail to be put into how the building assemblies are actually constructed. So that takes a little bit more level of nuance into account in that modeling pathway.
Cool, thank you. And also just quick time check, it is 8:50, just so you know.
All right, thank you. So this third pathway for code compliance is using the same principal methodology of modeling out total performance of the building envelope, but it also takes into account operational energy. So a HERS rating is going to model out, as I just kind of noted, in even more detail, the individual aspects of performance of the building envelope. The tools used for a HERS rating take into account things like shading, seasonal shading, from whether or not you have a window that on the second floor is partially shaded by the sun versus that window below it on the first floor with no roof overhang is not shaded. It takes those levels of detail into account into the performance modeling of the building envelope, but it also takes into account the performance of the mechanicals that are installed and in use in the building as well too. So better mechanicals, better heating, cooling equipment, good ventilation, lower levels of air tightness, that's all accounted for in the compliance towards the maximum HERS score that can be earned. So again, here, the lower the score, the more better performing the building is. The 2024 code, fortunately it says 2023 right here, requires a HERS score of 60 for base code or less, and then 59 for stretch code. And then going back to 2020, those requirements are 61 for base code and 54 for stretch code. So those are your options at this point for compliance with HERS. Big difference here in the rating process and working with the HERS raters, you're working with a third party. And that third party is doing the energy modeling. They're also doing and required to do performance verification in the field. So they are required to come out and do at a minimum a thermal envelope inspection, which means verifying the as-built of the building envelope before they're closed up. Drywalls or, drywall and other interior finishes are covering those aspects of the building. The rater is also required to come out upon project completion to perform the required blower door testing and get a verified ACH for the building, as well as verify the flows of the ventilation system and just verify that the building was built based on the initial modeling done for the building at project initiation. So it does give a higher level of oversight to some extent over the actual performance aspects of the building. Again, it takes into account the totality of everything included in the performance of the building, not just the assets of the building shell. That's the big difference between REScheck and HERS, is that REScheck is only evaluating compliance with the code based on the attributes of the building envelope. It has nothing to do with the airtightness of the building, getting the building tighter than it would be required by code, the performance of the mechanical equipment, et cetera. But it gives you a pretty clear pathway for code compliance by way of working through the process with the rater. Another factor that comes into play here is that by taking the pathway of HERS compliance to show compliance with either the 2024 or the 2020 code, the minimum performance standard that is referenced by way of HERS compliance is what the prescriptive compliance pathway required for our zone, which is zone 6 in the 2009 IECC. So if you reference back to the 2009 IECC, the building envelope components are a bit different than what are in the code now and have been in the code for the past couple cycles. So because it's a comparative analysis of how the whole building works, it gives a little more leeway as far as different component conformance or performance goes. Just as an example about the level of detail here, this is just a screenshot of the Windows inputs for a typical rating. So again, you've got in this scenario the window typology, what the exact window specs are for each window type and each orientation, which wall it's assigned to, the total area of that window compared against the gross area of the wall assembly it's installed in. Again, taking into account overhangs and shading of percentage of shading during different seasons. So very deep level of detail that goes into the performance modeling for the building. This is another just example of some of the analysis reports that are generated by these data inputs that can help guide other aspects of the design for the building. This will give you estimated design loads for heating and or cooling, the actual consumption load for what the building is going to use on an annual basis. And then because you're putting in specific energy costs into the modeling of the tool, estimated costs for different aspects of operating that building during a typical year. The report, we shared the REScheck compliance report that's generated through using the REScheck tool. The HERS pathway generates a rating certificate. So the rating certificate is a summary of all of the different aspects of the building that were modeled, and then what the final HERS score is. In this example, you've got a negative HERS score because of the attribute of the photovoltaics that were installed in the building, with the photovoltaics as rated and as sized for this, exceeding the capacity of what this building's annual energy consumption would require. This is modeled data. It may or may not work that way in the real world, but this is the data that's captured by the tool and then generated into a report. And then this is discoverable through MLS and other pathways for energy performance related to the building. The tool will also generate reports that may or may not be applicable to support other programs related to energy performance, the 45L tax credit being more specific, which is now going away. But if you're using a HERS pathway for code compliance, the actual certificate that's needed to be completed to access that tax credit is generated by way of using this tool and using this performance pathway. These are HERS raters that are working in Vermont, that are local here in the state, that you can reach out to if you're interested in exploring the HERS pathway for code compliance. You can also reach out to us as well too, and we can help move you in the right direction. But these are all partners that have are RESnet certified and can do HERS ratings here in Vermont. I think that's pretty much it. I already covered at the beginning here what the code certificate looks like, how that's going to be completed depending on the building type, signature at the bottom of the certificate. So I'll just give it some space here for any questions.
Yeah, we did have another question come in from Benjamin, asking if there is a scenario where the points plus checklist will show compliance, but the same building and REScheck will not, or vice versa.
I'm not going to be able to say specifically without trying some scenarios, but the same referenced U factors for assembly are used for both prescriptive compliance and for REScheck. But one thing that REScheck does take into account would be, like, for example, it's weighing out the total performance of all assemblies. So you may have, maybe there's 2 or 3 walls that are just meeting the minimum 0.044 spec for above grade walls, but then you've got, for some reason, two other walls that are just bangers, and they're like getting to a 0.25 or 0.025 U factor for the assembly, so much better performing than the other 2 walls. Or windows is probably where that may show up more specifically, where you may have some windows that are meeting the 0.30 minimum or maximum spec for U value. But then you may have a couple others that are like 0.32, but then you have some others that are 0.27, so it models that out in totality in the REScheck pathway. Different than what prescriptive requirements would allow for. Prescriptive is basically, you don't have that option to have a couple 0.32 windows and the rest of them are 0.30, but you're required to not exceed 0.30 for any of the windows in the building if you're going to meet prescriptive compliance to the T.
Thanks, Steve. And as mentioned, as we're wrapping up, we've got, we can take some more questions if folks have a few more minutes. I want to quickly launch the AIA credit request. I was unable to include it in the survey afterwards, so I just want to make sure that folks that are seeking credit have a fast and easy way to do that now. If you're not seeking AIA credit, then that's okay. You can kind of ignore the 2 questions. But again, just wanted a fast, easy way for folks to be able to add that in now. But Steve, feel free to continue to answer questions while the poll is open.
Thank you.
Alex, were there any other questions that came in?
Yep, we just got one more from Joey here. In REScheck, do you need to ensure every assembly and light item is compliant, or just for the entire building as whole needs to be compliant?
I think that question was answered with my previous answer, that it's taking the totality of the assemblies into account. So it's comparative analysis. And if you have better performing components in one area of the building that can outweigh the other components, then it can give you totality of compliance as the whole for the building. But again, I'd have to, you'd have to model that out specifically to an existing scenario to really understand, what your options are in that.
Thank you. Not seeing anything else at the moment.
All right.
Okay.
Well, if there's any further questions on this, changes for what's occurred now, as of the executive order of last week, your options have increased, obviously, and different reference points at this point now too, given that there's two pathways to go, 2024 or 2020. Feel free to reach out to us and let us know how we can help to navigate that here moving forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Alex. And thanks everyone that made time to join us today. Excellent questions. Steve's contact information on the page there, but you can also reach us just by calling the main customer support phone number on our Efficiency Vermont website. We'll add this recorded training to our energy code support page, along with several others. You'll see trainings for 2024 code that we've been doing this past 18 months or more now, as well as recorded trainings for 2020. So you should be able to see both there. And again, just reach out. No, there are no questions that are silly questions at this point. So if you're wondering, I'm sure somebody else is too.
Okay.
Hope you have a great day and excellent weekend. I'll leave the poll open another minute or so, just so anyone seeking AIA credit can get their member number in. And yeah, hope we see you soon.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.